would like to introduce Cory Doctorow. Now, it's been a while since we've been trying to get Cory here, and it's been Cory has been on my wish list since LCA Ballarat 2012, and we've been trying to get him ever since. Cory is a science fiction novelist, journalist, technology activist, and is a special consultant to the EFF, a non-for-profit social liberties group that defends freedom in technology, law, standards, and treaties. Cory is also co-founded the open source peer-to-peer software company OpenCola, and is also an award-winning author of Walk Away, Little Brother, and Information That Doesn't Want to Be Free, among many others. His latest book, Attack Surface, is the standalone adult sequel to Little Brother. Now, please join me in finally welcoming Cory to LCA. Sit back, relax, and enjoy, and welcome to linux.conf.au, Cory. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here at last. It is a long way to go from any of the places that I've lived since you started asking me to Australia, although it is my one of my favorite places to go. I have even a favorite banana bread place in Melbourne, so I always welcome the chance when it arises. I wrestled with what to talk with you folks about today, and I reckon that the thing that would work best is a talk I wrote about what it means to care about technology policy, and the story that we have about the people who care about technology policy. That when I say policy, I mean like how technology and the laws around it affect our lived experience, questions of social justice and economic justice and so on. And there's a story today about the people who care about this stuff, that they were kind of blind techno-optimists, that back in the old days, in the 1990s, when this issue of Wired magazine came out, I bought this on the intercity bus on my way to uni, where I was doing an interdisciplinary degree with a heavy emphasis on computer science. And within like a week, I dropped out of uni. So there's this story that the people who were reading these early articles and the people who were writing them were kind of techno-optimists, digitally addled naives who thought that if only we could give everyone a computer, everything would be fine, and that they completely failed to foresee all the possible ways that our technology could become dystopian. And you know, I happen to know some of those people now because I ended up working for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm about to start my 20th year with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I happen to know them, and I'm here to tell you, nobody starts an organization like the Electronic Frontier Foundation or any of the sister organizations around the world like Electronic Frontiers Australia or openmedia.ca or Quadrature.net in France or Digital Rights Ireland or any of those other organizations. No one starts an organization like that because they think everything's going to be great. You start an organization like that because you are, on the one hand, legitimately excited about how amazing things could be, and on the other hand, absolutely starkly terrified about how badly they can go. You know, there's a great paper that Public Knowledge published a few years back by Michael Weinberger about copyrights, patents, and 3D printing, and it has the best title. The title's so good I want it on my tombstone, and that title is "This Will All Be So Great If We Don't Screw It Up." And that, I think, is the founding ethic of the early technological boosters, the people who cared about policy and who wanted not just to get technology into people's hands, but to get tech policy right. And it's hard to realize now, but back in the olden days when this was all getting started, you know, technology was not the source of a stock bubble. It was a kind of fringe activity. And the only reason to get involved with these clunky old computers was not that you dreamt of untold riches, but rather that you were just really passionate about it, that you sat down at the console for the first time and discovered something that made you say, like, where have you been all my life? And then you just fell straight through the screen. And, you know, I think that most of us can recognize how that story unfolds. You know, think about the first time you write some code. Writing code is about crisply expressing your will. And if you express your will with sufficient precision, the computer will manifest your desires. That it will do what you told it to do forever at a price that's so low that it's indistinguishable from free. And that once you add a modem to that computer, once it's connected to a network, you can project that wheel around the world, not in the way that, say, Mark Zuckerberg does, where he waves a wand and says pivot to video and a million journalists lose their job, but rather you can create some code that solves a problem you have or delights you, and then everyone else in the world can just click a button and the code will do the trick that you taught it for them. So, we sometimes call software a recipe, but it's not quite like a recipe. If your gran has the world's greatest, pumpkin bread recipe, and you perfect it and publish it and hand it around to other people, they still have to get the ingredients and follow the recipe correctly. Software is like a self-executing pumpkin bread recipe. You express your will with the precision, then you encapsulate it in code, and then you give that code to someone else, and rather than having to replicate your expertise, they press a button and pumpkin bread just starts emerging from their computer, digital pumpkin bread. And once you have the network, it's not just that you can spread your will around the world, but also that you can discover communities of people who have thinly distributed, hard to locate traits that are important to you. People who know the words for the things that you've felt for all your life but have never been able to express. People who might understand that gender is not a binary, or that Black Lives Matter, or, more toxically, that you can dress up like you were extra in a Civil War movie, get a tiki torch, and march the streets of a mid-sized Southern American city chanting "Jews will not replace us." But irrespective of how I feel about the community that you find, I think that we can all understand that when you find the people who know the words for the thing you felt, that is a very compelling experience, that it's a thing that makes you passionate. And the thing that you get when you can write code, or choose what code you write, or find the people who can help you express who you are, the thing that delivers, the word for what that delivers, I think, is self-determination. This very powerful thing of being able to decide how your life is going to go, how your day is going to go, how even this societal matrix that you're embedded in will be structured. That self-determination is the source of tremendous satisfaction, and it's very energizing when you can decide how your life is gonna be lived. And the fights that we had over technology policy, the first ones, they were all about self-determination. Like, you're here at this GNU Linux conference. Presumably you know the story that Richard Stallman, a young, bearded artificial intelligence researcher, walked into his lab at MIT one day, and the printer wasn't working the way he wanted it to, and he went to fetch the paper tape that loaded the printer driver so that he could punch some new holes in it and do what he wanted to, and the drawer was locked. And Richard said, "Why is there a lock on this drawer?" And they said, "From now on, we lock the drawer, right? You run the printer driver or you don't run the printer driver. What you don't get to do is make the printer driver work the way you need it to work." No self-determination. And, who can forget this classic of the genre? Bill Gates, a member in good standing of the Homebrew Computer Club, had just bought from a third party the foundation for DOS and adapted it lightly so that it would run on the 68K processor. And he found that his colleagues at the Homebrew Computer Club were doing to this code what they did to all the code. They were tweaking it, they were changing it, they were adapting it, and they were building on it. And he wrote this notorious letter, right? The 99 Theses nailed to the church door. He wrote this notorious letter telling people to just knock it off. Or, I know Australia had a funny internet history in the early days of Usenet, back when it was just a couple ISDNs linking the entire landmass to the rest of the world. But if you remember those days, you will remember the story of the alt hierarchy. So Usenet was what we had to talk to one another on the internet. It was the first social part of the internet. And it was a bunch of message boards in a hierarchy. So you had like SOAK for social stuff, and you had REC for recreational stuff, and you had Sci for scientific stuff, and Comp for computer stuff. And the way that Usenet ran, it was a store and forward distributed network. And the raw compute, the storage, and the network capacity for it was provided by a bunch of people who called themselves, only semi-jokingly, the Backbone Cabal. The Backbone Cabal were network admins and sysadmins at giant telecoms companies, research institutions, universities, and government agencies. And these firms generated phone bills every month that were as thick as a phone book, a whole ream of paper. And what these sysadmins worked out is that they could use this store and forward network to communicate with one another, and the cost would just get lost in these giant bills. And so they ran Usenet under their bosses' noses without anyone knowing about it, right? Or at least not formally knowing about it. Everyone had deniability. But the one thing that they feared was that their bosses would someday wake up and discover not only that they were running Usenet, but that it was stuffed full of porn and bomb recipes. Because, many of these were publicly funded institutions. No one wanted a congressman standing up in the podium and saying, why is the University of East Nowheresville spending thousands of dollars of our taxpayers' money to peddle smut? And so, although the Usenet ran as a democracy, where whenever you wanted to add a new Usenet newsgroup, you would hold a vote, the Backbone Cabal held a veto over that vote, where if they thought, for whatever reason, that the thing that the users of Usenet wanted might bring the whole project down, they could just override the democratic vote and say, you voted wrong, go vote again, or we're going to do it different, or, sorry, you don't get that. You've reached the hard limit of our democracy. And mostly that was used for porn and bomb recipes and whatever, but sometimes it was exercised very capriciously. And the origin story of the alt hierarchy is that there was a guy who was an avid chef, and he wanted to start a group about cooking. And he thought that it belonged in rec.cooking. And the cabal thought that it belonged in talk.cooking. And when the cabal lost the vote and overrode it, this guy and his friends started a hobbyist alternative suite of message groups for Usenet called the alt hierarchy that did not have any votes to create a newsgroup. Anyone could create a newsgroup. You could create redundant newsgroups. You could create newsgroups that no one would ever use. You could create stupid newsgroups. You could fill newsgroups with pornography, pirated software, bomb recipes, whatever. The first newsgroup that was created on the alt hierarchy was alt.gourmand, right? It was for cookery. Because this person wanted to have self-determination, because he wanted to be able to talk about cooking not just as a thing that you chatter about, but as a source of recreational satisfaction. And it mattered to him. The self-determination question mattered to him enough that they effectively forked Usenet. And, within a couple of years, alt was bigger than the whole rest of Usenet, because it turned out everyone wanted self-determination. Some of them wanted bomb recipes. So some of the worst nightmares of those early tech pioneers. Whoops, I went 3 slides. Woo! Some of the fears of those early digital rights pioneers have come to pass, right? We do have the thing that everyone dreamt of in those days. We have total technology penetration. It's very hard to get away from the internet these days. But with that has come absolute centralization, surveillance, and digital manipulation. And the question I want to take up today in this talk is, how were we dealt such a stinging defeat? What was the blind spot that allowed technologists who were alive to this consequence, and in fact dedicated themselves to building a free, fair, and open technological infrastructure ecosystem. What was it that caused us to fail so badly? To produce the world that the Kiwi developer Tom Eastman calls the world of 5 giant websites, each filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And I think that the blind spot was not a failure to understand that dystopia was always there in our technology. I think the blind spot was a failure to understand monopolism. Now, that early commercial internet, that thing that we joined when we got our first PCs and our first modems and got online, it was a very dynamic world. Firms that had been absolute giants were eclipsed by startups that were literally started by a couple of people in a garage. New networking services rose out of nowhere and grew to dominate the sphere, only to be completely sidelined a few years later by a new competitor. It was an amazing time, and it felt like the idea of monopolizing the internet was like monopolizing the air. Like, how could you hold it all? It would just slip through your fingers. But what we didn't understand, or at least what I didn't understand as a kid, I got my Apple II Plus in 1979. I was 8 years old. We got a modem in 82. What I didn't understand was the role that the Department of Justice and other anti-monopoly enforcers had played in creating that world that we were so excited to be living in. So I want to tell you what I didn't know back then. I want to tell you what was going on behind the scenes. So I got this modem around 1982. 1982 is also the year that the Department of Justice broke up the monopoly telecoms company in the United States, AT&T, also known as the Bell system. And the Bell system had a lot of projects. One was ensuring that long-distance tariffs were as high as possible. And another was ensuring that as few people as possible owned and used modems, because they understood that the trajectory of modems was to take the services that they currently charged a premium for, like long distance, and just turn them into data services that they could no longer extract a premium over. And so when AT&T was broken up, long distance tariffs crashed, modems proliferated, software to run bulletin board systems and network systems like FidoNet and Usenet became very commonplace. And, although I was not even living in the country where all that happened, I was living in Canada, I benefited because my local sysops were able to install BBS software on their Commodore 64 or their Apple II Plus because the software was being produced in this giant market that had suddenly been liberated from its monopolistic tyranny. And the BBS scene that grew up because the long distance tariffs had crashed. So it became this very exciting time. And it was filled with companies that no one had ever heard of before. Like, IBM produces this PC in 1984, and that PC comes loaded with an operating system that doesn't even come from IBM. Now, I don't want to speak ill of one of the conference's sponsors here, but IBM was a bully. IBM had been under antitrust investigation for 12 years. It wasn't even their first rodeo, but they'd been under this antitrust investigation for 12 years before the DOJ finally dropped the suit, the same year that they decided to break up AT&T. It's a long story, but basically Ronald Reagan's antitrust czar said, we're going to break up one of these companies to see if we can get some competition here in America. And they decided that AT&T would be easier to break up than IBM because AT&T had been integrated into the government for so long, had been a regulated monopoly for so long. But IBM had spent 12 years in antitrust hell. Every single year of the IBM antitrust investigation, it spent more on its lawyers than the entire Department of Justice spent for every lawyer working on every antitrust case in the country. So after 12 years, they settled the case, said, let this be a warning to you, and show them the door. So IBM makes the IBM PC. And they understood that the DOJ, one of the things the Department of Justice had been so angry at them about was the way that they leveraged their hardware to create software monopolies. And they were like, if we make an operating system for this PC, the DOJ is going to tie our ankles to the bumper of its ute again and drive us up and down a gravel road for another 12 years. So let's find a couple of, beardy weirdies who can deliver an OS for us. And so they found Microsoft, who bought some code from someone else, did a little light rewrite, sold it to IBM, and suddenly became this company from out of nowhere that became a world-dominating firm, right? IBM fields the PC in 1984, and almost as soon as the PC hits the market, the PC clone hits the market. And the story of the PC clone is amazing. There was this virtuoso hardware engineer, this queer punk hardware engineer, a guy named Tom Jennings, who's a friend of mine these days. He lives, about 5 kilometers from my home here in Los Angeles County. And Tom at the time was working for a company called Phoenix. Phoenix got a copy of the spec sheet for the IBM PC ROM. And Tom used that to create a spec sheet for a new ROM, which Phoenix then turned over to a team of Texas Instruments programmers. They didn't want Intel programmers because they wanted to make sure that if anyone claimed that they'd copied Intel code, they could say, not only did we not copy Intel code, this team literally had never seen Intel code before they made the ROM. And they made the ROM and they sold it to companies that again came out of nowhere and roared to global scale. Dell, Gateway, Compaq. So, here I am, this kid in Toronto, seeing the market looking so dynamic, looking so amazing, seeing these, the people who just have this idea suddenly going global with it and thinking, well, that's the way this stuff works, right? That's just how it goes. But the reason IBM didn't crush Tom Jennings and his boss at Phoenix like a bug was that they had been in antitrust hell for 12 years and they were terrified of being stuck back in antitrust hell for another 12 years. So Microsoft, this creature of antitrust, right? This firm that only exists because of vigorous antitrust, becomes a monopolist, right? And so 92, the FTC and the DOJ opened their investigations into Microsoft saying, it seems like you guys are doing the thing that we busted IBM for. We want to come and have a look at your books and see what you're doing and so on. Now, Netscape, it was too late to save Netscape, but after 7 years of antitrust hell, Microsoft was so terrorized by the experience that when a couple of Stanford grads named Larry and Sergey decided to start a search engine based on citation analysis called Google, Microsoft did not do to them what they'd done to Netscape. They didn't crush them like a bug. They just sort of folded their hands and watched as Google went on to eat their lunch. So if you grew up in that time, I think you can be forgiven for feeling like there was something like this platonic perfect market that we'd often heard the theorists of markets discuss, right? Where you had low capital costs to start a new firm, right? You just needed a cool idea and your keyboard and a lot of attentive debugging, and you could make code. You had a global audience, and that global audience had a really low switching cost. So this created a market where the best ideas turned into companies, which would find customers and change the world. And if there was a firm that had a proprietary advantage because of its file formats, because of its data transmission tools or utilities, because of the way that it managed its APIs or what have you, all you needed to do was reverse engineer it, write a little bit of middleware, and your new program could read and write their old program's data. And what looked like a walled garden, right, all the data captured in a proprietary file format, became a kind of feedlot where you could show up to all these customers who are locked into the walled garden and say, look, you neatly organized potential customers for my product, mine is better. And it reads and writes all the files that you've already created. So come on over, jump the wall, I've brought a ladder, and be my customer. So what we didn't know, what we failed to appreciate, was that antitrust law was not a vigorous force that was going to defend us in the future. Rather, that antitrust law had been shot in the guts in 1980 by a guy named Robert Bork. Come on. There you are. Robert Bork. Robert Bork was Ronald Reagan's court sorcerer. He was one of these people who was a theorist of these perfect markets that would somehow produce these great optimal outcomes. And one of the things that Robert Bork was mightily sure of was this fringe idea that monopolies were good, actually. That if you squinted really hard at the underlying documents that prohibited monopoly in markets, that what you would find is that the laws that had been written not to ban monopolies per se, but only to stop monopolies when they created consumer harms, when they made prices go up. And Bork promulgated this idea that you should only prevent firms from creating monopolies when you could prove that they were going to raise prices. And then he set a standard for proving whether they would raise prices that made it effectively impossible. And so for the next 40 years, Ronald Reagan and his neoliberal allies around the world, including the Australian government of the day, and also the Thatcher government in the UK, the Mulroney government in Canada, where I lived, Helmut Kohl in Germany, and the whole suite of neoliberal influenced politicians, created the market conditions where you could do things that used to be radioactively illegal, create vertical monopolies, merge to monopoly, acquire your nascent competitors to neutralize them, and so on. Now, when people today talk about tech monopolization, especially people who like Robert Bork, you'll often hear a story about these exotic phenomena that cause tech to become so concentrated. They'll say, oh, it's a network effect that caused tech to become concentrated, or it's a first mover effect, or it's a data moat. But when you look at the companies, that's not how they grew, and it's not how they maintain their monopoly. The way that they grew and the way that they maintain their monopoly is not network effects, it's just Moneyball. You know, when you have unlimited access to the capital markets, when you have as much cash as you could possibly need, you can just buy your way to success. I mean, even if you're not very good at making stuff, you can buy your way to success. So think about Google. Google is a company that has made 1.5 successful products in-house. They made what we all, I think, can admit is a really world-beating search engine and a pretty good Hotmail clone. And everything else, the ad tech stack, the mobile operating system, all the other good stuff that makes them all that money, maps and so on, those are companies they bought. Companies that they would have been prohibited from buying before Robert Bork. And moreover, all the stuff that they made in-house is in the Google graveyard, right? It's stuff that just failed. Like the most recent one is the Wi-Fi balloons, which, deflated today. Now, network effects are real. They are a thing. But due to interoperability, network effects are a double-edged sword. We're accustomed to thinking of interoperability, even in the free and open source software world, as a collaborative project, right? You want everyone to be able to read and write an HTTP header. So you go to the W3C, you join the working group, you help specify the header, and then you make a reference implementation, and then everyone follows the reference implementation. And that is a really important source of interoperability. But there's another kind of interoperability, one that's even more important to technology as we understand it today, and that is adversarial interoperability, what we at the Electronic Frontier Foundation call competitive compatibility. It shortens to ComCom, which is easier than adversarial interoperability, which shortens to AI, and there's already a technology that got to that acronym first. So, organizations like AT&T, which had the Bell system, they were able to use network effects to lock customers in, and they had all kinds of things that they did that leveraged their lock-in to make more money thanks to their network effects. One of the things that notoriously the Bell system did was felonize connecting equipment to the network that hadn't been sold to you by a division of AT&T. And so phones, answering machines, modems, all the other things that we are now accustomed to plugging into our wall, AT&T was the sole supplier of, and they wouldn't sell it to you. They'd only lease it to you. So you had to buy it over and over again over your duration over your career as a customer of the Bell system. And once that rule was softened, thanks to overreach, the AT&T went after a company called Hushaphone that made a little cup that fit over the mouthpiece of your phone so that no one could read your lips while you were talking on the phone. And they said, oh, well, this device that you've mechanically coupled to the Bell system endangers the integrity of the network. And even their thoroughly captured regulators were like, oh, pull the other one. It's got bells on. Like, forget it. And that's when they lost their monopoly over mechanical coupling. Shortly thereafter, they lost a monopoly on electrical coupling. And then it was effectively open season. And again, you now had a bunch of people who had standard RJ11 jacks in their homes that the Bell system had provided, that had a standard dial tone, that had standard mouthpieces because everyone had the same phone, and people could make accessories and new equipment for them. And that network effect became a thing that cut against Bell, not a thing that cut for Bell. And it's not just the Bell system. This is part of the story of every tech giant we know, right? Think about the iWork suite. When Apple was losing the enterprise wars, and when a shop that had a bunch of PCs and one Mac just couldn't exchange documents with them. The Mac versions of Office were cursed if you were unwise enough to send your designer a Word file and they made the grave error of saving it on their Mac and sent it back to you. Like, you would never be able to open it again. And, Steve Jobs did not go on bent knee to Bill Gates and said, please, update the Office suite for the Mac. They just hired some coders who reverse engineered the entire file format and cloned it, and made this adversarially interoperable version that reads and writes all their file formats. And now everyone who had a Mac could switch, or had a PC rather, could switch to the Mac and take their documents with them. And so the walled garden became a feedlot again. And it wasn't just them. Lexmark sued a rival called Static Controls back when Lexmark was a division of IBM. Sorry, IBM. They sued them for remanufacturing their toner cartridges and cloning the chip. They had a little chip that had a 12-byte program that said either I'm a full cartridge or I'm an empty cartridge. And once all the toner was out, it would say I'm an empty cartridge. And if you put more toner in, it would still say I'm empty, and that wouldn't recognize it, and it wouldn't work in your printer. Well, it turns out that a program that's only 12 bytes long is pretty easy to reverse engineer. They reverse engineered it, made their own chip. Hey, guess who owns Lexmark these days? Static Controls, right? That's what adversarial interoperability buys you. And, Facebook had a problem when it got started, a very Australian problem. That problem was called Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch owned the dominant social network of the day, MySpace. And, you folks probably know that what Rupert Murdoch has, he expects to hold on to. And it's not like you can just go and politely ask him to let his users come to Facebook. That's not what Zuck did. Zuck made a bot that you gave your login credential and password to, and it would just trot over to MySpace, log in as you, scrape all your waiting messages, pop them into your Facebook inbox, let you reply to them, go back to MySpace and pop them back in. And now all of those MySpace users were not a captive audience for Rupert Murdoch. They were a captive audience for the man who would dethrone, the child who would dethrone Rupert Murdoch. So a thing happened on the way to the second decade of the 21st century, which is all of this adversarial interoperability, all this competitive compatibility has been effectively eliminated or criminalized thanks to patents, software copyrights, the rules against circumvention and bypassing DRM, enforceability of terms of service, and then these new rights that are working their ways through the U.S. courts, where Oracle, thank God they're not one of your sponsors, is suing Google over copyright on APIs, which is an idea that's absolutely insane. Copyrights are not supposed to protect functional works. If your API is not functional, you have a problem with your API. So, the thing that this does is it allows these companies that scaled the ladder using adversarial interoperability to kick the ladder away when they reach the top. So you may have heard all of these things, patents, copyrights, and so on, called intellectual property. And you know that free culture advocates, they don't like the term intellectual property. They make fun of it when people use it. And they say, we should call it an author's monopoly. That's what the Victorians called it. And, authors like me, creators like me, they get really pissy when you say, oh, you should call it a monopoly. Because even though I do have a monopoly over the things that I write, it's not a monopoly like Apple's monopoly or IBM's monopoly or Microsoft's monopoly or Google's monopoly. I don't get to set prices with my monopoly. The fact that the government gives me a copyright doesn't let me go to my publisher and tell them how much they're going to have to pay me for my book. But there is a funny thing that happens when you there's a funny thing that happens when you have monopolized intermediaries, when you have monopolized publishers, record labels, software companies, tech platforms. It's that they can take all of these authors' monopolies and they can aggregate them. And if you're a monopolist whose business consists of a bunch of authors' monopolies that were conjured into existence by people like me doing creative labor, then your monopoly becomes doubly sturdy, because not only do you have a monopoly that you can use to make more money with and to influence policy with, but you also have a monopoly that the government will defend for you. Because in order to undermine your monopoly, to fight against your monopoly, someone has to violate your copyright. They have to bypass your DRM to install a third-party app, or bypass your copyright to clone your API. And at that point, it's not you trying to like rope someone into a contractual term. The government is there for you to enforce this property right on your behalf. So I started this by saying that the internet boosters were sorry, I've skipped a slide here. Let me just find my place here. I started this by saying that the internet boosters were not blind to the perils of technology, but maybe they were a little blind, right? Once all the money was out there in the system, once there was effectively unlimited fortunes for people who got good at computers and made stuff for other people in cornered markets, people started to wonder whether they themselves couldn't get their hands on some of that money. You know, the myth of two guys in a garage that could topple a billion-dollar giant and become billionaires themselves fired a lot of technologists' imagination, and also sidelined a lot of their consciences. But these days, those dreams are behind us, right? No matter how cool your idea is, you're probably not going to become a billionaire from it, because no one wants to invest in anything that competes head-on with any of the big tech monopolists, even though they have double-digit year-on-year growth and billions of dollars in profits and vast margins. The investor class calls their businesses and the adjacent businesses the kill zone, and they will not invest in it because they understand that those monopolists can snuff out those businesses anytime they want. And so our aperture has narrowed. The thing that we dream of when we think about doing a successful startup is being acqui-hired by a tech giant. Instead of dreaming of billions of dollars or changing the world, we wonder if someday we might find a workplace where we have kombucha on tap and free massages on Wednesdays. And now that the big tech companies are liberated from the fear of losing their customers to their competitors, they have pivoted to out and out and absolutely blatant manipulation, lock-in, and abuse of those users. Now there's a thing about the code that does that manipulation, that lock-in, that abuse. It's all being written by techies. Techies who discovered their passion for code and for the field when they felt the thrill of self-determination that comes from writing code and projecting it around the world. And these people, their full-time job now, maybe your full-time job, is taking away that self-determination that thrilled you and set you on the course to who you are today, taking that away from everyone else, making sure that they never feel that thrill. Now, this is a very important fracture line. In the last couple of years, we have seen mass walkouts of technologists from the largest firms. Tech won't build it, no tech for ICE, tech against facial recognition, solidarity movements between Amazon tech workers and Amazon warehouse workers, union drives at Google, and so on. Some of these were driven by their own working conditions, the sexual predators who are allowed to function with impunity at Google, for example. But many were driven by a concern about the wider world that they were living in. Now, there's a technologist who's a kind of precedent for this, the kind of story of this, and his name is Robert Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer is in some important way the father of the nuclear bomb. And Oppenheimer managed the Manhattan Project, and he was a brilliant physicist. And there were a lot of people who were brilliant physicists, and there were a lot of people who were brilliant managers. But there were vanishingly few brilliant managers who were also brilliant physicists. And Oppenheimer, at least, came to believe that but for his complicity, the nuke never would have been built. And Oppenheimer came to regret the nuclear bomb for the rest of his life. Indeed, after the first test at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer turned away from it and began to quote the Bhagavad Gita. He said, "I'm become death, the destroyer of worlds." And he directed his life to fighting against the proliferation of nuclear weapons, something that Australians have been a big and important part of. I used to volunteer every time Helen Caldicott came to town to be an usher in the theater when she spoke. So I have spent a lot of my life trying to create Oppenheimers. In 2006, I wrote a book called Little Brother that came out in 2008. If you want to cut back to my camera there, it's this book, Little Brother and Homeland. And they're books about kids who seize the means of computation, who use technology to enhance human freedom and fight against oppression. And over the years since, I've heard from a lot of readers who said that the way that they became technologists or human rights workers who work in the tech space or tech lawyers who advocate for human rights in the technological world was by reading Little Brother and having that "it will all be so great if we don't screw it up" moment, being made alive to the peril and the promise of technology, how great it would be if we didn't screw it up. And it's been a source of great pride to me and great comfort. You know, when I struggle at night to fall asleep because it seems like the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket, I can tell myself at least there are people working in the field who care about this stuff and are thinking about it because they read my book. And that's a huge source of comfort and pride. And, you know, it came to a head when the movie Citizen 4 came out, Laura Poitras's Academy Award-winning documentary about Edward Snowden. And Snowden is on the run. He's leaving his hotel room in Hong Kong. And he grabs the stuff he's brought with him. And one of the things he grabs and stuffs in his go bag is Homeland, the sequel to Little Brother. So I just published the third Little Brother book. As you heard during the intro, it's this standalone sequel called Attack Surface. And it's a book for adults. And the thing that makes it a book for adults is not that it has sex in it. It actually doesn't have any sex in it. Little Brother has sex in it because it's for teenagers, and teenagers go at it like rabbits. This has not sex. It has coming of age. It has moral reckonings. It has a technologist whose life has been devoted to taking away people's freedom with technology, confronting what it means to have done that in her career. And I want to address a new generation of technologists, people who found themselves, through one rationalization after another, doing things that they never thought that they would do. And I think that's an urgent project because the author's monopoly, the IP, is now available not just to record labels or software shops, but to everyone, thanks to our embedded systems. And what that means is that these technologies aren't just things that lock you in. They're things where it's illegal to unlock yourself from them, where any attempt to unlock yourself from them can land you in jail. Now, I'm going to finish up here. I know I'm at the end of time. And I'm going to finish up by trying to give you some hope. The early days of the ecology movement did not have a movement at all. What it had were issues. There were some people who cared about owls, and there were some people who cared about the ozone layer, and there were some people who cared about fresh water, but they didn't think that they were all on the same side. They thought that they were fighting three different issues, and while the people over there who were fighting their issue might be nice people whose hearts were in the right place, they weren't fighting the same fight. And what changed, whoops, I've gone one slide too far. What changed was the word ecology. The word ecology turned 1,000 issues into one movement with 1,000 ways to get involved. That first Earth Day and the consciousness that it raised created a huge global movement where everyone had everyone else's back. You would fight for owls and I'd fight for the ozone layer, but I'd fight for owls too because I knew that you and I were fighting the same fight. And we're approaching a moment like that with Monopoly because Monopoly is not unique to tech. Monopoly is in every field. It's in government services, which is why the Carillion collapse was such a traumatic experience for people in the UK. It's in logistics. It's in N95 mask manufacturing and ventilator manufacturing. It's in heavy earth-moving machinery. It's certainly in the energy sector, and you in Australia understand what it means when the energy sector has monopoly rents that it can mobilize to distort your policy. It's in beer. It's in professional wrestling. It's in spirits. It's in eyeglasses. Every field has become dominated by one or two or three companies. The US is struggling to fill vaccine orders, in part because there's only one company that makes glass bottles left in the United States. And so that means that as we come to recognize that monopoly is at the root of all of our problems, that the consumer harm standard is a sociopath's charter, we will come to realize that we have allies everywhere. People who don't know that they're angry about the internet being contracted to 5 websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. They think they're angry that there's only 3 record labels left. And what they'll realize is that they're on the same side as us. You know, the tech giants like the story that there is something amazing about technology that made it monopolized. You know, they will settle for being evil geniuses so long as they get to keep thinking of themselves as geniuses. But the reality is that we've been in this place before, that the tech giants are just 3 sociopaths in a trench coat. They're not a giant at all. We know how to deal with monopolies. We dealt with them 100 years ago in the last Gilded Age. We have the toolkit. Tech has its own extra tools in the form of adversarial interoperability. All we need to do is mobilize it. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the organizers and the volunteers. It has been my absolute pleasure to talk to the Southern Hemisphere's Canada, right down to the horrific treatment of the First Nations people and the dominance of the energy sector. I feel like I know your pain. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference.
Thank you so much, Cory. That was fantastic. And I think Tom Eastman, who's actually in the conference, is just celebrating the fact that he was quoted.
I quote him all the time.
He loved it, and everyone loved it as well. So thank you
good.
so much.